Good evening. Whoa. It's working. It's good to see each and every one of you again this day. Hope you've had an enjoyable Christmas day. Last month, and it's been a month ago or a little longer, we studied several events in the life of the prophet Elijah. And when we met Elijah, he was telling Ahab, king of Israel, and the husband of Jezebel, that there was going to be a drought in Israel, as we read in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1. God sent ravens to Elijah to feed him during the first part of the drought, as we read verses 2 through 7. And later he was sent to a widow from Zarephath. God provided a miracle that kept her bowl of flour and her jar of oil from being depleted until the drought was over. Thus the widow was able to feed Elijah, as well as herself and her son. The son later died. Elijah restored him to life, as we read in 1 Kings 17, verses 18 through 24, or 8 through 24. And then later, in the third year of the drought, toward the time when God was going to end it, he sent Elijah to Ahab, at which time Elijah arranged for a contest to take place at Mount Carmel between him and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, to determine, as he said, who is on the Lord's side. As we read, we found that only the 450 prophets of Baal showed up, and Elijah defeated them, or God defeated them, after which they were killed. Immediately after that, Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel and prayed to God. And no doubt it was a prayer of thanksgiving for the success in the contest, but also it could have been a prayer for the rain to begin as well. And it was not long until a small cloud about the size of a man's hand appeared on the horizon. Don't you wish it was that simple here? And so God told Elijah, and Elijah told his servant to warn Ahab that he'd better leave in his chariot before the heavy shower stopped him. Then we are told that Elijah girded up his loins, outran Ahab back to Jezreel, no doubt cutting the cross country, while Ahab had to battle muddy roads in his chariot. Elijah's dealings with Ahab and the prophets of Baal is all in 1 Kings chapter 18. In this evening's lesson, Elijah will encounter an even tougher challenge as we look at 1 Kings chapter 19. And that challenge is, of course, Jezebel. So if you turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 19, that's what we're going to be looking at this evening. Or that's where we will start our lesson this evening. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done. I like that about Ahab. At least he told his wife everything. And how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more so, if by about this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them." And he was afraid, got up and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. Put himself on a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked him for himself to die, and said, "Enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Then he lay down, fell asleep under a broom tree. But behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, Arise, eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a ground loaf of bread baked on hot coals and a pitcher of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. But the angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him, said, Arise, eat, because the journey is too long for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and he journeyed in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now we know that Jezebel was Ahab's Phoenician queen wife. And as a result of their marriage, Israel was threatened by what might be called Phoenicianization. And Jezebel was the chief promoter. The prophet spoke out against it, and she could not understand why her husband was so reluctant to deal with them as adversaries. Finally, she took matters into her own hands and launched an all-out attack on the prophets. She tried to destroy them all, but a man named Obadiah, who was the governor of Ahab's palace in Samaria, as we read last month, hid 100 of them in caves, as we read in 1 Kings 18, verse 4. The passage in 1 Kings 18, verse 3 would imply that Elijah was out of the country at the time. When Ahab got back to Jezebel, or Jezreel, he reported to Jezebel all that had happened, and she sent a messenger to Elijah with those words, May I make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow, about this time. Now, I don't know what time that was, but evidently it got back to Elijah, and Elijah did something a little unusual. To me, it's a little ironic. Elijah, who had fearlessly faced the 450 prophets of Baal, is now running scared from Jezebel. He went to Beersheba, about a 3 days journey, and left his servant there while he went another day's journey into the wilderness. So he went 4 days' journey away from Jezreel, and there he sat down under a juniper tree and told God that he just wanted to die. One who will not experience death is requesting to die. As long as he had some hope, even a faint ray of hope that he might influence the moral and religious life in Israel, nothing could stop him, not even 450 prophets of Baal. Now, however, judging himself to have failed, he felt that his life was no longer worth living. Before the contest with the prophets of Baal, Elijah had trusted in God. Trusting in God, he had been extremely successful. But winning the contest did not accomplish what he thought it would. So he judged himself a failure. He must have expected the contest on Mount Carmel to settle the issue in everyone's mind once for all of who was God in Israel. Guess what? It did not. He panicked and fled in desperation. A person is most vulnerable to and least prepared for failure when he believes himself to be incapable of failure. That is evidently what Elijah thought after winning the contest on Mount Carmel. Destroying the 450 false prophets and having God answer his prayer for rain to end the drought. He could do no wrong. He was on a roll, and it looked as if it would not end. But then Jezebel swore to kill him, and he sank into a deep depression. One who believes he is not capable of failure will be satisfied that he has done all that is necessary for success. If he fails, he has no hope. There is nothing more he can do. That seems to be how Elijah was thinking at this time. On the other hand, one who is not willing to accept failure as an alternative never stops striving for success, no matter how many times he fails. He keeps on because he is trusting in the Lord and not in himself. Many years later, when the Apostle Paul was in danger of exalting himself, after being caught up into paradise and experiencing things of which he was not permitted to speak, he was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet him, to keep him from exalting himself. So he tells us in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7. Well, that's what Jezebel was. She was a thorn in Elijah's flesh. And perhaps it's what Elijah needed to teach him an important lesson. Elijah was experiencing an obvious lapse in his faith. Otherwise, he would have waited for the word of the Lord to guide him as it had in the past. And you might think that Elijah would have felt secure in Judah. However, the friendly relationship between Jehoshaphat of Judah and Ahab of Israel perhaps caused Elijah to question his safety even in Judah. Now that he had judged himself a failure and that his life was no longer worth living, he gave up. He laid down under the tree and went to sleep, evidently hoping God would honor his request and he would never open his eyes again. What should we learn from Elijah's experience? One lesson is that when things are going so well, because we're living a life based on trusting God, there is a danger that we can begin to think that we had a bigger part in our success than we did. And we may need a touch of reality to make us reassess things. Paul was given a thorn in the flesh. Elijah was given Jezebel. When we experience that touch of reality, we need to react as did Paul and receive strength from an even greater reliance on the Lord rather than to go into depression because of our perceived failure. That brings up another lesson. It is a mistake to judge our life as a failure when we have been living a life of trust in the Lord. What others think of us as failures and obstacles should become our stepping stones to greater faith and a greater reliance on the Lord. But Elijah gave up. He surrendered to the pressures of life. That he did not have to do that is obvious from the fact that God did not allow him to continue his self-pity session. His experience should help us to not accept surrender and giving up as an alternative way of coping with life. Now let's look at the power of the spectacular. and the power of silence. Elijah did not die. God had other plans for him. We read in the New Testament that Elijah was one of the three on the Mount of Transfiguration. So we know Elijah did not die. An angel woke Elijah and told him to rise and eat. And at his head was bread cake and a jar of water. He ate, drank, lay down again. Second time, the angel told him to rise and eat, saying to him, because the journey is too great for you. Some have suggested that Elijah had probably fasted prior to the contest with the Baal prophets and just did not have enough time to eat. And so he was physically weak and he needed strength to continue his journey. Before God could deal with his spiritual problems, Elijah had to take care of his physical problem. So Elijah obeyed the angel. He ate the cake of bread, drank the water. He did it the second time. And then he went 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. 1 Kings 19, verse 8. 40 days and 40 nights. That's a long time. Think we could live 40 days and 40 nights without eating? Probably could. Thus, like Moses before him in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 9, and Christ after him, Elijah fasted 40 days and 40 nights. On the mountain, we find that Elijah stayed in the cave. While there, the word of the Lord came to him in the form of a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah no doubt thought about the zeal and devotion to the Lord he had formerly had and contrasted it with the Israelites who had forsaken God's covenant. After justifying himself by that comparison, he concluded by saying, probably in a belligerent, upset tone of voice, I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Notice, as we read in verse 10, that he almost implies that God had just sat back and let all that happen to him, as if he didn't care. I know we sometimes feel that way, but that's not true. God always cares. So Elijah was told to go stand on the mountain before the Lord. We are now in verse 11 of chapter 19. And he evidently went out of the cave and stood just outside of the entrance. So let's look at verse 11 through 14. So he said, God said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by. And a great and powerful wind was tearing out the mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Then he said, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of armies. For the sons of Israel have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they have sought to take my life. It would seem that as Elijah stepped outside the cave, he was greeted with a tempest of such force that it ripped the rocks loose from the mountain and sent them thundering down the mountainside. And we are told, but the Lord was not in the wind. Next was a terrifying earthquake. And we are told, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. The earthquake was followed by a fire. It may well be that fire here refers to lightning as it does in other passages. For example, Exodus 9, verses 22 through 24. And we are told, again in 1 Kings 19, but the Lord was not in the fire. Have you ever been in a cave on the side of a mountain? And it started to rain, and it started to lightning, and the crackling of the thunder. And all you could do was just stand there at the edge of the cave and just watch it come down. Watch the lightning. Perhaps you haven't, but I have. Growing up in the mountains, sometimes we got caught in such storms. And this was somewhat what was taking place here with Elijah. First came the wind. You think the wind in Texas is sometimes bad? Have you ever seen boulders shake because of the wind? And then came the earthquake. As if the wind wasn't enough, the earth shook, and the boulders that were loose, they also tumbled down the mountainside. And the cave itself shook. And then after that came the lightning or the flash through the sky of the dark clouds that were outside the cave. Sounds kind of scary to me. But it tells us God was not there. God's supernatural intervention into man's history is often described in the Old Testament as accompanied by storm, earthquake, and fire. For example, in Psalm 18, verse 10 through 13, he rode upon a cherub and flew. He fled upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place. His canopy around him, darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him passed his thick clouds, hailstones, and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. And then we read in Psalm 68, verse 8, the earth quaked. The heavens also dropped rain in the presence of God. Sinai itself quaked at the presence of God, the God of Israel. Getting back to 1 Kings 19, we find that after the fire was the sound of gentle blowing. King James Version says, a still small voice. But literally, it is a voice of gentle silence. Elijah had apparently retreated back inside the cave some distance during the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. Now, recognizing he is in the presence of God, he wraps his face in his mantle that he might not look upon God. 1 Kings 19, verse 13. Why was he afraid of looking upon God? Well, we know back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, God speaking to Moses tells him, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. At that point, Moses knew something that we would not learn until Exodus chapter 33, when God told him that if you look upon my face, you will surely die. For no man can see me and live. Exodus 33, verse 20. Evidently, Elijah was aware of that, so he wrapped his face in his mantle. A voice came to him and asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" As far as Elijah is concerned, the facts have not changed, and so his answer is the same as before. Perhaps he rehearsed in his mind the good things he had done, the bad things Israel had done, and said, perhaps in a softer, more humble tone of voice this time, and he repeated, "And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." But don't you imagine that the tone of his voice is a little different this time? The first time he uttered those words, he was probably defiant, loud, and belligerent. And now I would like to think he speaks with a gentle tone when he is saying, "What do I do now, Lord?" It's not recorded, but that he repented of his lack of trust in God seems evident from the fact that God gives him another assignment. What can we learn from this experience of Elijah? Well, first of all, we can learn to overcome the kind of depression Elijah experienced. One thing we need to do is get busy doing what the Lord has told us to do. Elijah took his first step, but when he got to the mountain, it seems he hid himself in a cave, content to make that his home. We need to learn that God does not give us a command and then abandon us. He's going to be with us always, as we spoke of this morning. When God asked Elijah, secondly, what he was doing there, we learn from Elijah's answer that he had compared himself with the Israelites and had made a wrong conclusion. Elijah had concluded that he was the only faithful person around, and it did not matter to God. In the New Testament, we are taught by Paul not to compare ourselves with others. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 12, Paul tells the church in Corinth, "For we are not bold to class or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves. But when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are without understanding." Sometimes, when we are depressed, as Elijah was, we want something spectacular to yank us out of that depression. While it's true that the spectacular and the dramatic have had a place in God's order of things in the past, today, God's program is more often accomplished through the gentle silence of trust and obedience. When Elijah did not find God in the spectacular, it seems he retreated back to the cave. Sometimes people make that same mistake in their lives today. They do not find God in the spectacular, and so they retreat. But then they often make a mistake Elijah did not make. They do not look for him in a gentle silence of trust and obedience. Perhaps the message for Elijah was that the time for the spectacular The storm, the earthquake, and the fire had passed. Now it was the time for the prophet to proclaim the word of the Lord with the power of a gentle silence. The still small voice of protest would in time become a powerful force. And the message for us is that there is tremendous power in God's word and God's will for our life. So, what's next for Elijah? Well, we find that the Lord then sent Elijah to Damascus to anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elijah as the prophet who is to replace him. 1 Kings 19, verse 16. Then in the next two verses, verses 17 and 18, God answers Elijah's complaint about the wickedness of Israel and his being the only one left who is faithful to the Lord by telling him how each of these three men, Hazael, Jehu, and Elijah, will be involved in carrying out his will in respect to Israel. There it reads, "It shall come about, the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elijah shall put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." The sword of Hazael would punish the children of Israel who had forsaken the covenant. Those who escaped the sword of Hazael had reference to Ahab, Jezebel and their household, who were responsible for tearing down the altars and slaying the prophets. They will be executed by Jehu, 2 Kings 9, verses 24 through 33, and 2 Kings chapter 10. Elijah thought he was the only one in Israel who remained faithful. But God pointed out to him that there were 7,000 who had not bowed down to Baal. There are some circumstances connected with this that cause most Old Testament scholars to interpret this last command as symbolic, meaning simply that these leaders, Hazael, Jehu, and Elijah, will be ministers of God's vengeance against this rebellious people. The circumstances that seem to point this direction are as follows. First, at the time, Israel was at war with Syria. Hazael did not become king of Syria until after Elijah was taken to heaven, and Elijah had taken his place as the prophet of God. In addition, Hazael was king of Syria before Jehu was king of Israel. They also point out that Elijah was a man of peace who, so far as we know, never used the sword or commissioned its use by someone else. Elijah would slay the wicked, but it would be with the words of his mouth, such as is mentioned in Hosea chapter 6, verse 5, where he says, "As slain them by the words of my mouth. And the judgments on you are like the light that goes forth." And we read in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 8, in regards to Christ, when it says, "Then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth, and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming." So this is how Elijah was going to slay those who were wicked. After answering Elijah's complaint in 1 Kings 19, verse 17 and 18, The very next event recorded in chapter 19 is the call of Elijah to be a prophet, which begins in verse 19. And it tells us, "So he departed from there, found Elijah the son of Shaphat, while he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed over to him and threw his mantle on him." Nothing is said about Hazael or Jehu. What are some of the lessons we should learn from this experience of Elijah? First of all, sometimes when our life of trust in God is so successful, we begin to think that we were somehow responsible for that success. I know I've said that earlier. And then when things do not go like we hoped they would, we simply cannot handle it. We must not only trust in God, but we must give Him the glory and look to Him for our next success, because it will come. Secondly, failures are often our stepping stones to success. Looking back upon your life, how many times can you find yourself being knocked down, but you had to get back up so you can keep on moving? From Elijah's experience, we also learn that God knows some things we do not know. Elijah did not know about Elijah. He did not know about the 7,000 who had not bowed down to Baal. And when things happen to us that we do not understand, rather than become depressed, we need to remember that God knows some things we do not know, and continue to trust Him. Now, I'm saying some things in a sarcastic tone, because I know He knows most things I don't know. So, we look at verses 19 through 21, the end of chapter 19. It tells us that Elijah found Elijah plowing with 12 pairs of oxen in his field. Some have taken this to mean that Elijah was a man of means. He was working a 12th pair of oxen, implying that 11 other men were also working a pair of oxen in his field. Elijah went over to Elijah, threw his mantle on him, and Elijah's mantle, as we know, was a rough, hairy garment that had become the trademark of Elijah, and as such was a symbol of the prophetic office he held. To throw the mantle over Elijah was an appropriate way of designating him as a prophet who was to take his place. There was no interview involved here. There was nothing that Elijah had to ask Elijah. Why? Because God said that Elijah was to be the next prophet. And that was good enough for Elijah. So rather than asking him a lot of questions, he just simply went up there, threw his mantle over him, and walked off. Evidently, and in doing this, we see Elijah leaving his oxen and running after Elijah. Elijah not only understood what Elijah meant by the rather strange act, but he must have made up his mind to go with Elijah immediately. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like Peter and James. He asked permission to tell his parents goodbye. Now, This is quite different from the situation we read about in Luke chapter 9, where a would-be disciple of Jesus asked for permission to stay and bury his parents. In that situation, he did not want to follow Jesus until his parents were dead and gone. That may have meant years before he would have been ready. But Elijah tells Elijah to go ahead. The words in the New American Standard are, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" This could be paraphrased by saying, "Sure, go back and tell them goodbye. I've not asked you to repudiate your own flesh and blood." Not only did he bid his parents goodbye, he dismantled his plow, slaughtered the 2 oxen with which he had been plowing, and sacrificed them over a fire made by burning the wood of the plow. That's really burning the bridges, or in this case, the plows behind us. He fed the people with the meat, and he left to follow Elijah. What a great example Elijah presents us on this occasion. He recognized Elijah's action as a call from God. He responded immediately. He made a total commitment to God and demonstrated by his sacrificing to the Lord what had been his means of livelihood. He truly did burn his bridges behind him. So in conclusion, and very short, what has been our response to God? We are not all required to burn our bridges behind us to the degree that Elijah did, but we do all need to be more attuned to God and his willingness to help us in all circumstances of life, even when it seems as though God may have abandoned us. God never abandons us. He says that he'll be with us always. He says that he will not forsake us. He promises us a place in his mansion. And yet we have to be, as Elijah, who finally realized that in order to do that, we must have a silent trust and a silent obedience. Do as he says, and then go about fulfilling his purpose in our lives. If there's anybody who needs to respond to the invitation at this time, we invite you to do so now as together we stand and we sing.
here this evening, you haven't taken the